Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome everybody to this online session at Bien 2022 in Brisbane. It's a real pleasure to have you join us for this panel session, Basic Income in a Political Economy of Crisis, which is obviously highly pertinent to the conference themes of basic income crisis and transformation. We'd like to welcome everybody from around the world, those getting up early in Australia and those staying up late in other parts of the world today. Just wanted to stress to everybody, and I'll point this out at several stages throughout today's session, that you need to post your questions for each panelist through the Q&A portal. So you can participate in the chat, but the chat is not where I'll be picking up the questions as the chair. You need to do it through the Q&A portal. I probably should have mentioned my name's Troy Henderson. I'm co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab and also at the University of Sydney. So we're going to have 4 excellent speakers today. Each person will talk for about 15 minutes, or hopefully precisely 15 minutes, followed by time for 7 minutes of questions. So do keep your questions coming through for each of our speakers progressively as we go through the session, so we're able to flow straight from each presenter into a short discussion. And first today, I'm going to introduce Bernhard Neumärker from FRIBIS and the University of Freiburg to deliver the first talk for today. So Bernie, over to you.
Thank you very much. Today I would like to present a specific scheme of a crisis basic income called the net basic income. It's in some way revolutionary because it is against all tradition of capitalist oriented rescuing, but I think it shows that the net basic income and that basic income in itself is very good to not only support social policy and good living in crisis, but also to support economic policy during the crisis, which seems to be new. We presented it as a petition in Germany to the parliament in 2020, together with Susanne Wiest, where we argued we need to be prepared for a crisis with a crisis basic income, and the net basic income is a specific example. So in the meantime, we published some papers, or there were discussion papers on the topic I would like to present. So the political relevance of UBI, at least in Germany, but you can transplant it to many other countries, is that we have a lot of current crisis constellation. The COVID pandemic, clear. We had in Germany a flood crisis, and also in other countries, many natural disasters where immediate, urgent need is important, so to speak, automatic need. We have the climate crisis. We could regulate with a carbon tax basic income scheme. We have the war crisis. We have I would say an inequality crisis, and I will refer to this also, that the net basic income is an idea to stop heavy distribution during the crisis towards unearned income via rents and via interest rates. And we have a lot of derivative crisis, the supply chain breakdown due to the war or COVID, the insolvency crisis now due to the war, it will come, the energy crisis we have in Europe. We have also now inflation crisis, and we have skilled labor shortage, especially after the corona crisis. And for all these, we have implications for a new UBI society in the field of fiscal policy. Yes, financing as a financing option, for example, via certain taxes or via sovereign money. We have social policy things for substituting and complementing old-fashioned social policies, and economic policy, because especially NBI during the crisis could support specific economic and environmental policies so that they do not break down during the crisis. I will show some examples. So in crisis, the NBI could be an emergency measure, and it could be a reform action. So the argument is it could be an implementation device, because especially in crisis, you would need a basic income. I would say a specific basic income, which takes care about the basic payments you need in crisis. And we could organize a gradualistic reform, implementing the NBI first as an emergency measure, and then also not to move to the revision, yes, when we are back to prosperity, so that we could also use it as a first step into a full UBI after the crisis, a so-called participatory full basic income, by which you can also pay your rents, your duties, your obligations, and so on. Now, you see here the typical concept of a classical state aid measure, by the way that the state aid measure tries to help entrepreneurs, workers, solo employees, freelancers, and so on. When you see here the double red line, their income or their profits are stopped due to a lockdown or due to a supply chain breakdown, and so on and so forth. But the argument of the classical state aid measures, it was a very dominant argument, at least in Germany, but I think in all Western countries, was we have to support the persons who don't earn income or profits during the lockdown, because they have to pay their rents to the landlord, this is the person V, and also pay their redemption and interest on capital, yes, that's the arrow K, to the bank or to the capital giver. So you see immediately that these traditional state aid measures imply a huge redistribution from performance income, which is stopped here due to the lockdown, and unearned income of rents and interest and redemption due to landlords and banks and capital givers, because they still receive the regular rate even during the crisis. That's how our system works. We say paying rents and paying interest rates and so on is system relevant. So therefore, we have to give state aid measures which support these payments. These payments seem to be for the system more important than to run and to support the consumption of the performance entrepreneur, of the worker, and of the solo entrepreneur and the freelancers, for which the regular income has stopped. So this is a big problem. Why? Because many crises arise as unforeseen contingencies. So means testing does not work for these unforeseen contingencies. You don't have a necessary ex-ante statistical data that these contingencies will occur. And therefore, classical aid measure, as well as the classical workfare system and support system, shows very low target efficiency. So due to the administrative problems of these state aid measures, we have recognized a lot of non-take-ups and the low reliability and lacking predictability for the citizens. Yes, the danger of insolvencies, of omission of system-relevant groups, and so on occurred. So, as I mentioned, we have a huge distributive priority, at least implicitly, of unearned income, and this leads to inequality and unfairness. And for example, Guy Standing called this the rentier capitalism. We take care about rents, not so much about performance and other issues, but about paying a fee, so to speak, for rents. And it's very interesting that the citizens in such a system are still quiet and do not say, oh, this redistribution is not justified during the crisis, because where is the solidarity, where is the fairness of the guys who receive unearned income when we always try to protect unearned income by our emergency measure? So my proposal is that in emergency basic income, which I call NBI, the net basic income, is appropriate because this is an ex post governance concept. It means it's not necessary to have statistical measures from an ex ante point of view, which you do not have in these disasters, in these crises, which arise as unforeseen contingencies, because the net basic income is always there, because it's financeable, also compared, you will see it also compared to other social state, regular social state measures, and because it leads a society to privilege freeness, especially to organize in a, say, coercive way, solidarity and fairness. At least it simulates it. So you see, for example, we try in Germany to adapt our workfare system towards that, what we call citizens' money, citizens' income reform. The problem, and this is an argument of my approach of new ordoliberalism, is the reform moves into a direction due to the experiences of the crisis, which is not necessarily strategy proof. This means this should be a criterion for privilege freeness. Why? Because the first step for the citizens' money in German, or citizens' income in Germany, Bürgergeld, is that we stop the asset proof, the asset test. And now you see, due to the crisis, the unforeseen contingencies, and due to the arising of the digitalization, even rich persons see that they can lose their jobs. For example, pilots, locomotive drivers with good income, very specific groups who have accumulated, and also rich guys who have accumulated some assets. And if the asset tests stop, then it's clear they can protect their assets. They don't have to employ their assets for their own rescuing. So therefore, it's very good for the rich ones, yes, when the asset test is stopped and when the still old-fashioned traditional ad measures still work to give them the income and to stop asset tests when they became unemployed during a crisis. So this is not a very good thing. One needs another system, and that system is the net basic income. And you see it here. You see there might be a lockdown, the double red line, yes, of income, of shifting resources to the entrepreneur. Yeah, that's, for example, the supply chain breakdown, and also profits, G, yes, for the performers, U, A, and S. And because all the persons, also the landlord V, the banker B, and the capital giver KG, receive net basic income, yeah, we can stop also the payments from the entrepreneur under the lockdown to the landlord. Yes, this is the first double green, and the second double green line is you can stop also the payments to the bank, because everyone in the bank receives a basic income. This means the redistribution to unearned income during the crisis also stops, and you see net basic income can be relatively and also absolutely seemingly low. Yeah, we have calculated for Germany, for example, it could be 600 euro and so on and so forth, because you have to employ it only for consumption payments during the crisis, not for paying the landlord or for paying the bank. All this is stopped. And the banker has at least also his net basic income. He cannot say, I cannot survive. We need the interest payments. And the landlord, even when he is small, he receives, he can say, he would say usually, I need it because I need the payments for my old age or privately organized pension. No, he receives the net basic income. Also, he is secured just like the person for which the performance income stopped. Yeah, and you see, not only this social policy works, yeah, it works also to support a running economic policy. Here, for example, during the crisis in Germany, we said we have to support training positions so that the firm does not stop training during the crisis, because their revenues, their sales are stopped. Yeah, and we would like to pay promotion of training positions, but the entrepreneur said this does not work because we have to pay our duties to landlords, to banks, and so on. But you see on the right-hand side, with the net basic income, the entrepreneur will pick the training positions. He will not stop the trainee program for apprenticeship. He will not stop training because he receives net basic income. All the young persons under the apprenticeship training receive net basic income. All the others receive net basic income, and he will pick up the training position to organize the training for the young person. So this kind of economic policy and necessary education, and apprentices training will still happen under the net basic income, whereas under regular measurements, it will be stopped due to the duties the entrepreneur should pay to landlords and banks, but which he cannot pay because his sales stopped. So, and also with energy renovation subsidies, it works. Even if for, say, a private household or an entrepreneur, his income stopped due to the crisis, and say for someone who rent a flat of them, yes, the income also stopped. MI is the person who rents and who pays the rent to the landlord, the entrepreneur, yes, who would like to.
I just need and say that if you can move towards your conclusion.
Yeah, okay. You see, you can also with net basic income erect and maintain energy renovation subsidies. So my conclusion is, first, you can finance it. We have calculated it against the social budget, against the Corona aid budget, by arguing what is nearby basic income payments out of the regular social budget and out of the Corona aid budget. We make a relative profit to the Corona aid and to the social budget. So we save more or less we would have saved, at least in Germany, 100 trillion euros. And second, you see here also this kind of emergency basic income society is clearly more resilient than a so-called short-time allowance society, which gives short-time payments, short-time allowances only to specific interest groups, not to everyone, not to the solo entrepreneur, not to the freelancer, not to the person who organizes restaurants and so on, so that the basic income society is more resilient than a short-time allowance payment society. Last remark, which is very important, is that we can do this. It's no problem, and we can pay it. So therefore, we should start implementing these kinds of crisis basic incomes. And after the crisis, we could move then towards a full basic income by only augmenting this net basic income up to, say, 1,200 euro, where then the receiver of the basic income can pay rents and duties. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation, Bernie. And if I could just remind all of our panelists, as soon as you finish speaking, to put yourself on mute. And if I could remind our audience members today that if you do have a question for any of our speakers, to put it in the Q&A portal, not in the chat. So the Q&A portal will come through to me. And please do that progressively throughout the presentations. We have time, I think, for one quick question, and it is from our co-panelist, Jurgen. So over to you.
Thanks, Troy. Thanks, Bernie, for a very interesting talk. And of course, it's a whole complicated issue here, and you haven't had the time to like explain the whole sort of thing. I just there's something I'm trying to get my head around, and let's just use the quick example of the landlord. Did I understand correct in your NBI proposal that given that everyone receives the NBI, then the tenants basically no longer have to pay the rent to the landlord? But what then happens when, if I'm a landlord and I have 5 tenants, 10 tenants, 50 tenants, you name it, right? I'm still only getting one NBI. So in no way does that constitute a compensation. And in no way, presumably, would I support a system like that, given how much I would lose. But perhaps I'm missing a point here.
I think you are quite right. That's exactly the argument, because if we are in a crisis, we need some solidarity also from persons who receive unearned income, and that we do not automatically support these payments towards unearned income. Yes, and the argument is, and it is a very important argument, they also receive net basic income. They can survive as well as the performers for which the income has been stopped due to the disaster, due to the lockdown or whatever. So therefore, they receive the net basic income in the crisis, and they also can survive. So if you have 5 tenants clear, the payments of the 5 tenants might stop, but you receive net basic income and you have the same rescue payment as the 5 tenants have. And my argument is, during the crisis, this is nothing else than fair. Why should the landlord earn so much money by staying at home and waiting for the money from the state aid measure or the bank? Yeah. All these persons should not have a specific privilege. Why? Yeah, they even do nothing. They even do not perform. So therefore, one could say, okay, you receive also the net basic income, and this might be all, just like for the tenant also.
Thanks for the question, Jurgen, and the response, Bernie. If you could both now put yourselves on mute, that would be great. And we will move on to our second speaker, which is Otto Lehto from New York University. And just a reminder one more time that for those of you watching online, please do post your questions for Otto throughout the course of the presentation. Over to you, Otto.
Thanks so much. Are people still seeing the old presentation? I won't have a presentation of my own, but I think it might be best to have the previous presentation not be visible while I'm speaking, if that's possible. Thank you. Okay, so I won't have slides. I want to engage with you on this very fundamental question of what basic income is for and how crisis politics affects the chances for basic income, the desirability of basic income, and the future prospects and the consequences thereof. So the basic premise of my presentation, the title of which is something like Permanent Crisis Management, the Rule of Law and Basic Income, is that basic income, if it is to make sense, should be planned and instituted as a long-term institutional reform of the permanent structures of society, not as a crisis measure. And crisis measures towards basic income are often self-defeating and in fact pose a serious danger to both the public understanding of what basic income is for, and also I think of kind of the institutional feasibility thereof in the long term. I could be wrong, but I will give you some reasons why I think basic income should be designed as the rule, not the exception. Thinking of basic income as in emergency basic income, for example, as a crisis measure undermines certain key features of stability, predictability, and long-term planning that should be key parts of the basic income reform. Now, in political theory, there's the ancient battle between those who advocate for crisis politics as a crucial part of seems like it's back up there. Crisis politics as a means of getting increased performance out of the political system in times of crisis, in emergency times, in times that try men's souls, if you will. That is to say, there's the idea going back to Plato that what you really want is someone in a position of discretionary authority at the top of the decision-making hierarchy, capable of overseeing the whole organization, being responsive to external threats, being in the position to make rapid, agile decisions at the moment when we are working. Michael is saying you cannot see me. Is that true? Can you confirm that you can see me or not?
I can see you.
Okay, there we go. So anyway, so going back to the issue of so basically Plato's argument was that you need this hierarchical structure of decision making. So he used the example of the master sailor, someone who is the top of his game, someone who has the skills, the expertise, the wisdom, the prudence to act as the navigator on an uncertain ocean. Like you can imagine a stormy sea. The stormy sea is a good metaphor for crisis times. You have a stormy sea where you have everything from relatively calm sea with all the way up to sort of stormy sea with sort of bubbling of waves, all the way to basically sort of a deadly storm and even a tsunami that overtakes the whole sort of coastline. You see, so when you have what you need is, like, you can have a really bad sailor navigating through an ordinary lake or a sea, but when you start getting the waves start getting higher, the weather becomes more unpredictable. When you actually reach sort of crisis conditions, you need a master sailor, someone who is capable of navigating even the most difficult and unpredictable seas. Now, what this is really about is about adaptation to uncertainty and to new information. That is, you need someone or something or some structure in place that is capable of being agile, of perceptive, of new information, of the environmental conditions, in order to produce outcomes that allow for survival and flourishing in uncertain times. Now, what Plato's metaphor misses is that oftentimes you don't want to rely on a single source of authority, in a philosopher king or a master sailor, but instead what you want to rely on is a more distributive form of intelligence. You want to rely on perhaps the whole crew on a ship, shall we say. Perhaps you want to rely on the sort of large-scale distributive intelligence of the whole society to have the best outcomes in navigating a stormy sea or a crisis situation. So the same mistake that Plato makes, I mean, it's not always a mistake. Sometimes you do want to rely on a master sailor. Someone in, you can think of Ukraine fighting against Russia, for example. You might want to rely on a certain hierarchical, vertical structure of decision making in order to make agile decisions in wartime. So it makes sense in certain conditions. In other conditions, you do not want to rely on this kind of vertical decision-making structure in order to produce the most agile responses. And indeed, if you think about, for example, how animals react to an uncertain world, when you think of sort of the instincts and capacities that animals have in surviving an uncertain world, when, for example, they hear or see something that they don't recognize, this is loud noise coming from this direction, what they need is a certain response to that. And so what they often do is they rely on instincts, sort of inbuilt sort of quick measures, flee or fight, and this is one way of doing crisis management on a personal level. That is, you have an organism capable of tackling that moment, of reaching out, of perceiving and acting in an agile way to that moment, right? At the same time, you want to have a community. So some animal communities, for example, they have a division of labor where some animals are tasked with perceiving the environment and then sending signals to the rest of the pack, for example, of that now we need to move and whatever. And sometimes you want, but of course, human societies are even more complex than that. So the point is that you want to rely on oftentimes pre-existing structures. You have some division of labor, you have some pre-existing roles, some pre-existing, in the case of human beings, rights that they have. And in this sense, I want to emphasize the importance of these permanent structures, these permanent capacities. In our case, we shouldn't rely on instincts so much as on the sort of created or evolved social structures, that is, those parts of our institutional framework that are tasked with identifying problems, with solving them, and with empowering people to be responsive to threats and responding to them in an agile manner. So the type of structure that I have in mind is what is sometimes called the rule of law. The rule of law is that set of permanent structures which are granted to all citizens. There's a certain framework of rights and duties that people are exposed to that are predictable, that are sort of planned for the long term, that are transparent, public, and that allow people to make decisions over the long term, but also use that structure to be adaptive in unusual circumstances, these sort of unforeseen contingencies that Bernie was talking about. And oftentimes there's a conflict between this sort of Platonic model of a vertical hierarchical decision-making structure on the one hand, and on the other hand, this kind of a rule of law, distributive set of rights or rules within which we make decisions. And the question is, for this particular problem, this particular situation, do we more want to rely on granting more power to a vertical decision-making structure, or to kind of pre-existing relying on the pre-existing set of capacities and powers that are already there, and perhaps modifying them only slightly regarding the needs of the circumstances, and so on. And so the thing that I worry about, now coming to the basic income issue more concretely, the thing I worry about here is that emergency basic income oftentimes relies on the empowerment of certain discretionary capacities. That is, it relies on the Platonic model of vertical decision-making structure, where you have a public authority. Maybe it's an emergency authority, maybe it's the parliament or the president, whatever happens to be the particular name of that authority, tasked with making emergency decisions. So, for example, granting emergency cash grants to people, and therefore you sort of see, okay, you have this sort of all-seeing eye at the top, observing the world and then making those agile decisions. And whether it's democratic decision making or whether it's some kind of emergency authority with even dictatorial powers, in either case you sort of overstep the existing structure and you impose like a new temporary mode, kind of in crisis politic mode onto society. And I worry that emergency basic income, if it does that, sort of makes it hard to think of basic income as part of the basic structure, as part of that permanent institutional framework. it makes it hard to think of basic income as something that is placed there all the time, something that is in place there from pre-crisis times to in crisis times to post-crisis times. And in fact, there's also another aspect of this, which is that when people differentiate, draw the distinction between crisis politics and ordinary politics, this distinction, I think, is breaking down, because we are seeing more and more that crisis politics is really ordinary politics. That is, all politics is becoming crisis politics. There are good reasons for this and bad reasons. The good reason is that we are seeing that crises are more and more prevalent. That is, in a way, we are seeing that this whole list of crises, from wars to pandemics to global warming, is showing that a lot of the features of our society are subject to system risk, to disequilibrium conditions, to non-linear effects, so that on the higher level you get unpredictable outcomes, even if things are more predictable on the lower level. And in many ways, we need to have this idea of permanent crisis consciousness, of permanent crisis politics. But if we have permanent crisis politics, we need to think hard whether we want to rely more on the Platonic vertical model of decision making, or the sort of more distributive system of rights and rules as sort of empowering that part. For example, by giving people more rights and freedoms to act in their sphere, either as individuals or as local communities, or as distributed sort of networks of citizens. And I think the latter should be thought more harder as a good tool of solving many crises, and indeed as a necessary part of a society that has to deal with continuous crises. After all, the temptation would be there to sort of go from sort of from one crisis to another by sort of having either permanent crisis authorities that override the permanent structure of rules, and therefore give more power to authorities at the top of the society, or to say that we just give up, but that's not likely to happen. So we need some solutions. And so I'm getting close to the end of my talk here, and I wish to sort of summarize this, so that I think the danger here is pretty similar to, basic income people need to really think hard about what the temporary gains of instituting this kind of emergency basic income are, compared to the long-term harm that it may cause potentially to the society, or to the prospects of basic income. So I think if we really think hard about the idea of empowering this permanent structure, we need to empower basic income as a right, as a system of rights and duties. And therefore, I'm here agnostic about what particular model basic income should be. So I'm only talking, my model is compatible with negative income tax, with UBI properly conceived, maybe net basic income, I haven't studied that so carefully, or demo grant of James Buchanan, or there's a number of different ways we can have more of a permanent basic income structure in place. But I think we should look at that family of proposals and think that emergency basic income, if it is to be, should only be seen as a side thing, or as a kind of not as a stepping stone toward permanence, because crisis politics rarely is a good tool for achieving permanence, and more in terms of, okay, so if we need to combine these two approaches, as we almost certainly will, we need to combine the vertical hierarchical structure of decision making, because sometimes we need those, whether it's experts or military leaders or scientists, technocrats at the top making some agile decisions. But in order to also take advantage of the sort of distributed intelligence, the intelligence of the whole system, we also want to ensure that the basic abilities of people at the bottom-up level are utilized, and indeed something like basic income could be seen on a more permanent level as sort of part of that capacity building, that bottom-up rights structure that grants people certain powers of agility, of perceptiveness, and decision making under uncertainty. And I think in this sense, the rule of law could be strengthened by basic income, and the capacity of the society to solve its problems and to move from one crisis to another, whether these micro crises that are small in scale, or even these large tsunamis and earthquakes and pandemics. So I think in this sense, emergency basic income might have some practical usefulness, and I think it might, alleviate lots of suffering in some cases. But we should be wary of giving too much power to crisis political authorities, and thinking more of the long term and building up that long term capacities of people and their rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Otto, for that very interesting presentation. Just a reminder to those of you who are watching this session that you can post your questions to each of our speakers through the Q&A portal, and then I will be able to, as chair, put them to the panelists. So if you do have a question for Otto now, please put that one through. Otherwise, I might use the chair's prerogative and maybe, Otto, just push you a little bit on the question of emergency basic income, which is something we're discussing in various sessions throughout the conference. Do you think, on balance, that the type of emergency measures, which some people would call, natural experiments with quasi-basic income through the COVID-19 pandemic, on balance, would you argue that they are injurious to the cause of basic income as a political project in the near term?
I think it's a hard call to make. I think one of the problems is calling everything basic income these days. When we talk of emergency basic income, we haven't really even seen properly emergency basic income, which would, be as close as possible a full sort of basic income with all the features of basic income. We've seen cash transfers, some of which are closer to basic income than others. And I think it's just very important to not to jump to every cash transfer program and call it a kind of proto-basic income, because it's precisely the fact that they lack many of these characteristics of generality, universality, and all these things, which I think a proper basic income has, that I think people are also getting confused about what basic income is, to say, oh, we're getting cash transfers, we're sending, say, a one-time payment to not even the whole population, but to some part of it, and say, oh, we have basic income. Well, no, not really. I mean, people might be able to get some benefit from that, and that might actually give more room for society to hand out cash transfers, including these universal, unconditional, permanent ones that basic income would be about. But also it might just confuse the waters altogether. So I think it's a tough call.
A lot for that answer, Otto. Okay, on that note, we might move on to our third paper. I will just repeat my now regular message to both our panelists, if they can keep themselves on mute when not talking, and to our audience members, if you could please post your questions to whoever is speaking, if you do have one, through the Q&A portal, and I can then put it to the panelist when we get to Q&A. Okay, next we have our third paper, which is a joint paper between Leticia Morales and Jurgen de Wispelaere from Universidad Austral de Chile, and today Jurgen will be presenting that paper. Over to you.
Thanks, Troy. I hope you can see the slides as well as me. Okay, so this is a paper that's jointly, presentation/paper jointly put together with Leticia Morales. Leti was meant to present this, but funnily enough had an emergency at work, so can't participate in the panel. So you're stuck with me. This is a presentation that's very much thinking of emergency basic income as part of a sort of a comprehensive public health policy response. So it's very much catered towards a pandemic emergency basic income, but of course, as we've already heard in previous talks, and also we'll hear in the next talk by Joe, crisis or emergency, of course, can go way beyond the pandemic. That said, I mean, in this case, the presentation really is very much about pandemic. So a starting point. Just a couple of very quick things to sort of set the scene. So the first thing to realize is that when we're talking about pandemic, we're talking about a public health emergency as a primary, which then leads to a secondary economic emergency, if you like. So, because the public health emergency itself, the pandemic itself, has an immediate impact. But then, of course, government institutes a series of policies, lockdowns, isolation, you name it, all sorts of restrictions, and they themselves trigger a secondary emergency, right? So where there's something like a basic income or other type of measures come in is to accommodate both the effect of the primary emergency, the strict pandemic public health one, and of the secondary one, because, obviously lockdowns have major impact on, well-being, income, and so on and so forth of a vast range of people. Just a couple of key things here is that we are talking about, when we're talking pandemic, one of the features is that we have a very broad impact, not just broad in terms of global, right? It wasn't just certain countries. This had a global impact, but also within each society, it had a very broad effect, right? So, but that doesn't mean that the effect is equal, right? Quite on the contrary. We often see a very uneven impact, with especially people already in a vulnerable position suffering much more. And effectively, as becoming clear as we get more data, more research coming out, there's even people benefiting from the pandemic, right? So there is diversity here. Policy responses have become, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that in terms of mitigating the fallout, policy is really central. So that is a key debate. And then, of course, another point that's easily worth making is that the responses that we've had, the political responses, a lot of that happened under, a lot of huge pressure, had to happen very fast. But then at the implementation side, it rapidly faced a lot of hurdles, either institutional type of hurdles, lack of experience. And in general, it seems that most societies, most economic systems, most policy systems weren't really well prepared for something like a pandemic, right? So pandemic preparedness is really a very important issue, which we'll discuss later on. Very quickly, emergency basic income. We can debate the pros and cons, and Otto rightly mentioned that we should be very careful about calling every cash transfer a basic income. But under our view here, Leti and myself, we basically regard emergency basic income just as having all the features of a basic income, but then being temporary, not permanent, right? That's the key distinction. So it's individual, it's unconditional, it's universal or quasi-universal, but it is temporary, not permanent. And that is a huge distinction. Of course, temporary can mean a lot of different things. And, so we can start debating the pros and cons of short-term type of EBIs, 3-6 months, middle-term ones that have partially recovery built in, maybe up to a year, or long-term ones that really talk about, sort of having a system in place that really takes care of the full recovery, and that could be 2-3 years more, and so on and so forth. So the numbers don't matter as such. The key point is that even within this notion of a temporary emergency basic income, there's a lot of variation. We can have a lot of debates about what that really means, right? So another key feature as part of the background, one of the key points is, and I think this is something that perhaps was underestimated a bit in say, for example, in Otto's talk. I might be wrong here. This is not meant to be a critique, but it's often underestimated with people who are critical about emergency basic income, is that the pandemic context, in some sense, has changed the terms of the debate. So here are 3 features, for example, that are worth mentioning. The first one is that you have a lot of crises that impact on very particular specific groups. And the pandemic really has impacted a very broad range of people. It has impacted people in very different ways. So you have heterogeneity in there, but the scale of the impact itself, nevertheless, is an important thing. And that impacts in terms of the political pressure and the policy responses later on, right? So a second point is that there was a clear sense that the pandemic is an external shock. Now, one of the problems with a lot of policymaking and a lot of crisis is that this is always about a blame game. It's always trying to somehow, blame people suffering from a particular event as somehow being responsible for it. With a pandemic, that is definitely not the case. The pandemic is there. It was affecting everyone, right? And especially, of course, that the measures like lockdowns and isolation measures and restrictions were imposed by government very deliberately. So, so you can't be blamed for losing your job if it's effectively the government imposing restrictions that makes you being furloughed or losing your job and so on and so forth, right? So that changes the policy debate. And the third one is that there was sort of, especially in the early days, there was sort of a sense of this isn't about finding money to spend. It was almost like the money was there, like governments were willing to spend money. It was then a question about which is the right policy, right? So that actually changes the debate as well. Of course, we've reverted back to more traditional, if you like, policy type of perspectives. But at the very early stages, when the crisis was really, really hitting and there was a lot of political pressure, that was a very important change. It was almost like money was not an object, right? The key debate is within that money that we have to spend in order to support people, what is the right policy, right? Okay. There is a lot of sort of, a little bit of a debate about whether the pandemic really sort of constitutes a window of opportunity. I'm not going to say too much about that. Actually, the next talk will talk a lot more about that, so you get plenty of this. So this by way of background. So within that, and thinking about this as a comprehensive public health policy, we basically have three arguments that we think favor an emergency basic income as part of a comprehensive public policy response to the pandemic. And the reason these three arguments are based on three types of values that are quite central within public health and within public health ethics, right? They are urgency, they are vulnerability and priority to the vulnerable, and they are solidarity, okay? So let me quickly run you through this. The first point is about the fact that EBI, emergency basic income, has to offer an immediate and agile response. And this is actually, Otto in the previous talk was mentioning agility a lot as well. So we take a very, very similar view here, right? So, and one of the observations is that because the pandemic the pandemic literally started. So the pandemic started and immediately had a broad and severe impact. So the response has to be very, very fast as well. So lockdown measures had to be implemented immediately, very fast, had to be adjusted very, very fast. And the social protection response has to track that. So they has to be delivered in real time in response to what governments do in terms of restrictions and how the pandemic itself evolves. So that means that, things like bottlenecks, so institutional policy bottlenecks, delays are really, really detrimental, right? So, and resilience is really, really a key feature. Agility and resilience is a key feature. Where does basic income come in? Emergency basic income, because it's unconditional, it cuts down on processing time when administrative capability is already compromised. This is an important point. During the pandemic, the bureaucracy, the machinery, the administration itself was compromised, right? Bureaucrats also were getting COVID, were hampered in terms of doing their work. So against diminished capability, we need to have a system that can cut through bottlenecks and delays. Basic income, as we know, can do this. Emergency basic income can do this as well. So reduced time lag, backlog, administrative error is a key feature. And having said that, that means that emergency basic income is easier to administer practically, but that doesn't mean that there's still some hurdles remaining. We can talk about that if anyone wants. So first point, urgency is a key feature. EBI responds to that. Secondly, EBI protects the most vulnerable. So effective social protection must target and protect the most vulnerable. That's kind of like a core feature in public health ethics, right? Priority to the most vulnerable. Now, here is the really interesting thing. What constitutes as the vulnerable under a pandemic is a very heterogeneous population. So here's just some examples. So we had workers who were furloughed or fired or had to reduce working hours. We had self-employed people, precariously employed people, gig workers, who were facing all sorts of restrictions and had reduced demand of services. We had small businesses, business owners forced to close, face severe restrictions. Essential workers, on the other hand, had to work, and often had to work many, many more hours, but under more dangerous conditions. I mean, they were at risk. A category that's not listed here, but worth mentioning, is care workers. I mean, especially women. So women suddenly had to judge kids being being at home, not in school, and dealing with a job at the same time, etc., etc. So the category of vulnerable is very heterogeneous. So you need to have a system that deals with this. So a system that has a program for every type of vulnerable category is going to be very, very problematic, right? On the other hand, a system, an EBI that's fully universal, can capture all this, closes all the gaps. So that's a key feature. In addition, EBI also targets within universalism, as it's called. Why? Because the largest impact of even a uniform and universal payment is always going to be for those who are the most vulnerable, who are at the bottom of the income distribution, who are most at risk of losing income, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in that sense, EBI meets this goal of prioritizing the vulnerable. And then EBI is also solidaristic response. In public health ethics, there's quite a lot of talk about solidarity, what that means, different type of things. We know that COVID-19 is sort of a common condition that affects society at large. It also requires a collective response and coordinated action, right? So if you have lockdown measures, everyone kind of has to abide by that, otherwise the system doesn't work. So what do we mean with solidarity within that? Well, a solidaristic response in that sense, in our view, is about fair burden sharing across the population. Kind of linking a bit into what Bernie was talking in a different way, but having a similar intuition here as well, right? So the idea is that we have solidarity if these different heterogeneous groups, people being affected by the pandemic, but in very different ways, somehow find a way to share the burden. How do we do this with EBI? Well, EBI fundamentally is redistributive. Right. So, however, those details can vary a lot, but however you want to do this, the cost of the lockdown will be compensated and paid for by those who are better able to accommodate particular restrictions. Right. What does that mean? Like with everything in basic income, basic income is paid universally, but there's net recipients and net contributors once we think about the payment system in there. And one proposal that we flag, for example, is we could think of something like a pandemic tax levy, something like a tax to fund EBI very specifically that could actually kick in, for example, the year after the worst of the pandemic lockdown is done, right? So there's different ways we can do this, but EBI being redistributive means we find a way of sharing the burdens of the pandemic. So now I have a couple of minutes and I'll try and be very brief. We want to basically argue that, emergency basic income still has some problems. And the main problem here is that precisely because it's temporary, it actually, it can sort of do something in terms of immediate pandemic support, but it does very little in terms of pandemic recovery, which is a more long-term feature. It also does very little in terms of pandemic preparedness, because if EBI is this one-off type of thing, how are we sure that we are going to be prepared in case a similar crisis is going to happen later on? So very briefly, there's sort of two ways we can respond to that. One way is to say, well, we should think of EBI as a switch on, switch off type of thing. So you basically have you institute an EBI the moment there is a crisis. The moment the crisis passes, it gets fully pulled down. Another crisis emerges, and again, we put like a type of EBI forward, and crisis abates again, it goes down, and so on and so forth. What's the problem with the switch on, switch off? Fully taking down the system means that you're losing a lot in terms of preparedness, in terms of institutional capability, in terms of institutional knowledge, in terms of experiences, and so on and so forth. So one very simple example, it may be that today we're talking about a pandemic crisis, but in a couple of years down the road, we're talking about, say, an environmental disaster, and it may well be that there's two very different agencies that have to deal with this. So institutional knowledge may not translate, right? So what's the alternative proposal? And I'll do 1 minute and then I'm done with this. we're suggesting that this is where EBI linking into UBI could be really, really interesting. And we call that a dial-up, dial-down model. How does that work? We have a low-level UBI that is a permanent feature of society. Every time there is a crisis, it just gets cranked up. The level of the grant, if you like, the level of the payment gets dialed up, right? And if the crisis abates or whatever, we decide recovery is enough, it can get dialed down, but it never goes to zero. The UBI as a working operational system is always there. There's a number of clear advantages there. You have a fully administered system, and the only political decision, so to speak, that has to be taken is to influx more money into the system. And that's it. So we think that system is much, much more advantageous compared to the switch on, switch off model. So we definitely favor dial up, dial down. It's always also worth mentioning that in Marica in Brazil, that's effectively the system they had in place. They had already started setting up a low-level basic income. And when the pandemic hit, they just cranked it up. And of course, afterwards, it was taken down again. Okay, but the bottom layer, so to speak, the fundamental permanent feature here is important to keep in place. So in a way, what we're proposing here is that, yes, there is something to be said for emergency basic income as a response in a pandemic, right? It sits very, very well with sort of core values, core perspectives in public health policy responses in general. But the best system possibly could be the one that really interacts with the permanent universal basic income feature. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Troy and questions. Thanks very much for everyone listening.
Thank you very much, Jurgen, for that excellent presentation. I've got an initial question, just coming back to your earlier definition of emergency basic income, where it seemed that the principal, or maybe indeed only, distinction between basic income and emergency basic income was a temporal one, and specifically that an EBI is temporary. And I was wondering, with the other criteria of BI that you included in that definition, were there any actually clear examples through the pandemic that satisfied those criteria, and that you would clearly call an emergency basic income?
My understanding is that Tuvalu had an effective, full-on type of emergency basic income. I mean, there's going to be, there's going to be a fancy plenary session after this on people discussing emergency basic income, and I think Ugo Gentilini in that session will mention the fact that he considers as like 11 EBI type of schemes that effectively were in operation. So many of these schemes, I mean, again, there's sort of there's pros and cons in being too broad with the definition, so to speak. But I think a scheme that is fundamentally unconditional, individual, not household-based, and quasi-universal. I mean, some of these schemes are affluence tested and take out, the top layers of the income distribution. But I mean, in my view, I would even count that towards something like an EBI, right? So having said that, I mean, many of these say schemes that were like one-off payments, or a one-off payment, and then maybe there was a second payment, but it wasn't clear whether this was going to come or not. Clearly, they have problems, right? So our view of an emergency basic income is to mimic UBI as clear as possible. And in a way, for example, if we institute something like an EBI, make it clear to people that this is going to be a 6-month measure, you will get you will get 6 payments and so on and so forth. So as less as possible, make it part of the haggling of the political process, right? I think Otto was very, very correct in pointing out that this is a key issue, right? That this is a key concern. So.
Jurgen, okay, so we have 2 or 3 minutes left for a final question before going to our last speaker. A reminder again to everyone that you who is watching online, that you can post a question to speakers through the Q&A portal. So just a quick question: is EBI compatible with the human rights approach to UBI, After all, human rights probably should not be turned off after a crisis is over, or can EBI be seen as only necessary in certain extraordinary times when vulnerable human rights require it? So that's from Otto, Jurgen.
I mean, but you know, I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, if you have a flooding situation, right? So flooding situation, suddenly a lot of people, or you know, massive fires and so on, for which we see increasingly happening as part of climate disasters. Suddenly, this means people are losing their homes. They have to, as part of an emergency response, they have to, in some sense, be given some sort of temporary accommodation, right? The moment that temporary accommodation usually means that whatever, they might be given this for a couple of months with the expectation that later on they find their own way into more permanent type of housing situation. The right to housing is a clear human right, right? That does not get switched on and off. But the way in which policy responds to a particular disaster is both informed by that right and informed by the specific conditions that's been happening, right? So, I mean, so in that sense, disaster and emergency policy responses, of course, have to be fundamentally rooted into human rights approaches. But that doesn't mean that the moment a policy gets instituted, there's no way in which it can be switched off again, or we're violating the human right. That's not how that works.
Thanks a lot for that answer, Jurgen. Okay, we will now turn to our fourth and final speaker, and this is again a joint paper by Joe Chrisp and Jurgen. Joe Chrisp from the University of Bath will be delivering the paper. So, Joe, over to you.
Thanks very much, Troy. So I'm going to be talking again about basic income and crisis, and touching on quite a lot of the same themes that we've seen in the previous presentations, with probably a similar kind of slightly critical approach to Otto's presentation, touching some of the same themes but in a slightly different way. So just going to start off by kind of articulating what Jurgen and I both kind of have articulated as the standard narrative of UBI, before decomposing it into the different types of crises and how these might play into a kind of relationship with UBI. Finishing with a kind of hopefully an interesting framework for thinking about what the relationship in general is between crisis and basic income. Okay, so I would say that in an important way, two key crises have shaped our understanding of what the relationship between crisis and basic income is. The first of those was effectively the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and to a large extent also the subsequent Euro crisis, which fed this idea that, if you like, the previous order was dying, that the system of economic policy, socio-economic policy had failed in important ways, and that new ideas needed to be thought of, a new kind of framework for macroeconomic policy, for social policy, and a number of other areas, which gave a room for basic income to kind of enter the discussion. So, if you like, financial crisis was a stimulant for discussion and support for basic income. And similarly, COVID-19 has kind of equally been associated with the new energy around basic income, at least in part due to the we might not want to call them basic incomes, but certainly kind of unconditional cash transfers that were provided in the immediate response to the pandemic. And I think this understanding of the relationship between crisis and basic income is kind of built on two basic implicit assumptions. The first being simply that policy solutions need a policy problem, and a crisis is a severe policy problem, and that basic income can latch itself onto these kind of serious policy problems in a way that is important. So necessity is the mother of all invention in that sense. And the second kind of basic implicit assumption is that because basic income is quite a radical policy solution, that it's more likely to be considered when the policy problems are incredibly serious or critical. And this feeds into the kind of critical junctures aspect of the social policy literature, that for the most part, path-breaking policy reforms only happen at these kind of really important moments, whereas most of the time it's adaptation of the existing system. So it requires these kind of big crises, whether it was the financial crisis or COVID-19, to actually spell any kind of consideration or support for basic income. Oh.
We seem to have lost Joe.
I think. Sorry,
Joe, have you rejoined us?
I froze for some reason there, but I think I might be back based on the fact that I can see my mouth moving. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened there. Okay, so in a sense, we're exploring and challenging this
distribution
leads to the consideration and support for basic income, but probably important to state at this point that what we're not doing is necessarily saying that using the framing of crisis is a bad way of arguing for basic income, but of nuance in terms of thinking about what the relationship is. So we think that the two key questions for thinking about the relationship between crisis and basic income is twofold. First, related to the effectiveness of a basic income. So how does a crisis strengthen the case for a basic income, just in terms of its effectiveness of solving the crisis in some sense, but also critically, how does a crisis affect political support for UBI? And in this sense, we're looking more at the political economy of a particular crisis, and in a sense, these two things do not necessarily go hand in hand. So just as a kind of way of sketching the different types of crises and what the relationship, how the relationship might differ in terms of basic income, response, the support is increased in relation to a crisis. We've sketched a few different ways of thinking about this. So we have economic crises such as recessions, also technological change, health crises that might be anything from pandemics to a kind of crisis of care, and environmental crises such as climate change or disasters. And so really it really depends on the type of crisis, how we think that basic income is either effective or more supported in response to this crisis. So just to briefly go through a few examples, if we think about recessions and unemployment rising in relation to a recession, we might think that a basic income, this, to be clear, I'm rehearsing a series of arguments and that show the different ways that we can think about effectiveness and political economy, rather than this is not the central part of the argument, but just rehearsing a few important arguments for why we might think a basic income is effective. So we might think in the same way that Jurgen articulated in the previous presentation, that all the benefits in terms of reduced bureaucracy mean that providing swift support to people during a kind of economic crisis where there's unemployment is a more effective support. We might think that fiscal stimulator during times where the economy is depressed, whilst also not providing kind of disincentives to employment. So those are the kinds of ideas often supported for why recessions justify the use of a basic income. But also interestingly, there's evidence that I've, for example, found in analysing election commitments to basic income, but also many other people have remarked on the relationship between these kind of economic crises and support for basic income, that there is a clear link between increases in unemployment and then support for basic income. But the problem with this, as Otto alluded to in his presentation, is that these are fundamentally temporary dynamics, and even the effectiveness of it is often framed in terms of responding in the short term to a crisis. But as soon as that crisis disappears, the arguments for having a basic income in the first place seem less important. And equally, the kind of political support behind basic income tends to dissipate as well. Interestingly, when we think about technological change, and clearly there are different ways of imagining the idea that technology manifests itself in terms of a crisis. For example, if we think of technological changes spelling the end of employment as we know it and huge kind of mass unemployment, then basic income is perceived as a kind of permanent income support for jobless people. Or if we think, as Jeff Crocker, for example, has argued, that technology is leading to a declining labor share, and that therefore we have to stimulate consumption by providing a basic income, perhaps funded by sovereign money or some other means of taxing wealth or something similar. But in a sense, this argument is really thinking about a kind of permanent response, a permanent function for basic income in response to a longer term crisis. So in that sense, it's a much more interesting argument in terms of arguing for basic income. However, some of the issues in terms of political economy is that if we look at, for example, workers who are most at risk of automation, that's not related to support for policies like basic income in opinion surveys. And there's a kind of narrowing of the political constituencies when normally workers at risk who are in more privileged socioeconomic positions, such as people with high income or as part of a union or with higher education, are particularly against basic income when they're at risk from automation. So there's this kind of what is normally a broadening of the constituency that risk provides does not find its support in basic income. So even though we might think that, and this is likely to be disputed and discussed, but while we might think that basic income has a kind of more permanent function for dealing with this kind of technological crisis, the political economy does not seem to be so obvious. Thinking about health crises like a pandemic, Jurgen's talked about a number of the benefits from a kind of basic income in terms of responding to pandemics. Although I would also add that one thing a basic income doesn't do that was a key goal of governments during the pandemic was the preventing rises in unemployment through job retention schemes. Clearly, a basic income does not necessarily achieve that. But again, here we've got the same problem of it being a temporary justification for a basic income that doesn't necessarily lead to its implementation after the crisis has finished. And at the moment, we haven't seen any indication that the support has dropped for basic income since the pandemic has finished, but we might suppose that given that the justification for it was temporary, that therefore the political economy might also be temporary in that sense as well. There's been no kind of complete reshaping of the labor market or different class structures directly related to the pandemic as far as we know so far, so that it's not a clear justification for why pandemics would have caused a change. Just to briefly kind of go over these other potential types of crises to think about. Often people talk about a basic income as a way of dealing with a caring crisis because it can provide support for informal care by providing carers with a livable income. But again, questions might be asked about whether that needs to be done in conjunction with different types of services. But crucially here, that it's not clear what the political economy mechanism is. If we have an aging society with more and more people needing care, does that necessarily mean that universal benefits provided to working age people is going to be the kind of more popular policy solution to a crisis like this, rather than those that are more clearly going to directly benefit older people? If we think about environmental crises, again, with disasters, we have the same kind of issue of there being perhaps a very clear benefit in terms of swiftness and the lack of bureaucracy involved with providing a kind of unconditional grant to all people that have been affected. But clearly this is going to be targeted support provided to specific groups for a specific purpose. And it's not clear how a disaster is really going to generate the kind of more long-term solidaristic support for a permanent basic income. So if anything, we might suppose that the kind of division between areas affected by the disasters and those not affected by the disasters is likely to create more issues for developing a permanent basic income than beforehand. And finally, I may unfortunately allow my own beliefs about the argument for basic income from the perspective of climate change to colour this, but certainly one argument has been that basic income could be used as part of a degrowth or a post-growth transition in which people are encouraged to consume less due to and work less due to the access to a basic income. But again, it's really not clear what the political economy argument is here, because in what way does climate change the coalitions of support for basic income? And for me, it's really difficult to imagine what the link is, and I don't think much work has been done in terms of thinking about how the political economy changes in response to climate change, rather than just thinking about the arguments from first principles in that regard. Okay, so that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the different crises and how we might think about it, both their basic income's effectiveness in response to the crises, but also how the political economy has changed as a result of the crisis. And so our way of summarizing this is to try and think about some key features of different crises and how they might relate to both the effectiveness and the political economy of basic income. So one key aspect of a crisis, particularly if we're thinking this really justify it as a very serious crisis, is the severity of the issue. But I think rather than assuming that the severity of a crisis necessarily serves as a justification for basic income, it clearly sharpens minds in the way that people will be absolutely determined to find the best possible solution to whatever the crisis is. And in that sense, in cases where, for example, if we're talking about a caring crisis, a basic income is probably not going to be the absolute perfect solution to the caring crisis. It may be one of many policies that will help the situation, but the more severe the crisis is, in a case, for example, like the caring crisis, I would assume the less likely a basic income is going to be considered as a central part of the solution. I don't know why that keeps happening. So clearly, severity may help in cases where basic income is a very clear solution to the problem, but in cases where basic income is kind of being crowbarred in as one of many different policies as part of a bigger package, it's not clear that it's going to necessarily serve as impetus for the implementation of a basic income. Similarly, with the urgency of a crisis, so a crisis that really needs to be solved as soon as possible, clearly the administrative speed of a basic income is in its favour and may provide justification for basic income over other policies. But at the same time, the kind of level of political mobilization and coalition building that is required to actually implement a full UBI is a kind of political quagmire that probably most political actors are not going to want to step into when a crisis is particularly urgent. They're going to be more off-the-shelf solutions that they think are going to be less politically dangerous, that will solve this problem urgently. So that's a problem. So whilst it has administrative speed, the politics of basic income are likely to provide a kind of break on its use as an urgent solution. Of course, putting the kind of temporary basic incomes to one side, which relates to our third aspect that we think is important as a feature of crisis, which is the permanence of it.
Just come to your conclusion.
This is my last slide. So clearly, the more temporary a crisis is, the more temporary many of the justifications and probably the political economy is going to be for supporting a UBI. And finally, in a sense, this is kind of two things within one, but the ubiquity of the crisis. So both the extent to which it affects everyone, and therefore it's likely to justify a kind of more universal solution, but also the extent to which multiple crises are happening at the same time. And I think the extent to which basic income is a good solution for many different things, rather than necessarily the perfect solution for one thing, lends itself to a kind of universal polycrisis type situation. And that's something that we wanted to think about a little bit more, but clearly very focused, temporary, urgent crises might not be the best environment for the support for basic income. Okay, so very briefly, the conclusion is that cyclical or temporary urgent crises may offer a window of opportunity and heightened attention, but demonstrably have not actually delivered tangible policy reform. We feel that a permanent crisis is probably the kind of crisis most amenable to the implementation of a basic income, but not any crisis. And rather than focusing purely on the kind of whether a basic income would be a successful policy in times of a crisis, we think that the political economy is really key, and that's one of the things that has really hampered any progress on the implementation of a basic income. Okay, and that's that from me. Thanks very much for listening, particularly if you are in Europe at this time, but also I guess in Australia is pretty early as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot for that, Joe. And I was going to interrupt that penultimate excellent slide, providing the overview of the framework that Jurgen and you have developed. I think there's a lot in there that we could discuss further, but unfortunately we've come to the end of this online session. And so I would just like to thank, again, all of our four excellent speakers who are all, I think, in different time zones, and as am I. And to remind you, as Jurgen mentioned earlier, that today at 11 a.m. Australian time, whatever time that is for you, we do have a plenary session on this theme of emergency basic income that many of you touched on in one way or another. So I'd encourage you to participate in that if you can, but realise that some of you may need to head off to bed. So thanks a lot, everybody. Look forward to seeing you in future sessions at this conference, and hopefully in person down the track. Cheers, guys.